Hey there! Welcome to another chilling tale from the dark and mysterious world beyond. Tonight, I'm going to share with you a true story that still haunts me to this day. A spine-tingling account of my experience as a night watchman at an old, abandoned cemetery. This is a story of nighttime horror and supernatural encounters that will have you sleeping with the lights on. So get comfortable, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown, the graveyard shift. It was a cool autumn night when I first started my new job as the night watchman at Willow Grove Cemetery. The old graveyard had been closed to the public for years, but the local authorities wanted someone to keep an eye on the place, make sure no vandals or trespassers were causing any trouble. As I did my rounds that first night, the eerie silence and shadows of the tombstones sent a chill down my spine. The full moon cast an ominous glow over the grounds, making the gnarled trees and crumbling mausoleums look like something out of a horror movie. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I approached the far end of the cemetery, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. One of the graves looked freshly disturbed, the soil around it upturned. That couldn't be right, I thought to myself. This graveyard had been closed for over a decade. No new burials had taken place. I quickly shone my flashlight on the grave, but everything seemed undisturbed. Telling myself I was just seeing things, I continued my patrol. But as the nights went on, I began to notice more and more graves that appeared to have been recently dug up. At first, it was just one or two, easy to write off as my imagination. But soon it was happening all over the cemetery. I would meticulously check each one, but the dirt was always settled, the headstones undisturbed. It was as if the ground itself was moving. The hair on the back of my neck would stand on end as I walked between the tombstones, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I'd hear faint scratching sounds, like nails against wood, coming from beneath the earth. My mind would race with terrifying possibilities. Had someone been buried alive? Were the dead clawing their way out of their coffins? I started to dread my nightly shifts, dreading what I might discover. The eerie silence of the graveyard would close in around me, making me feel suffocated. I jumped at every little sound, my imagination running wild. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a loud thud come from the direction of the old mausoleum. My heart pounding, I shone my flashlight towards the sound and nearly dropped it in terror. The heavy stone door to the mausoleum was cracked open, as if something had pushed its way out from the inside. I stood there, frozen, as a shadowy figure slowly emerged from the darkness. It was a person? No, not a person, something else. Hunched over, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin was gray and rotting, eyes sunken and hollow. It let out a guttural moan that made my blood run cold. I didn't even think, I just turned and ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was safely outside the cemetery gates, gasping for breath. I quit that job the next day. No amount of money was worth facing those things again. I haven't stepped foot in Willow Grove Cemetery since. But I'll never forget the horror of that night. The realization that the dead were clawing their way back to life. To this day, I can still hear those unearthly moans in my nightmares. So if you ever find yourself in need of a late-night job, I beg you, steer clear of any old graveyards. You never know what kind of unholy terrors might be lurking in the shadows. Sweet dreams, my friends, and watch your step out there. I can't get that image out of my head. The twisted, rotting figure emerging from the mausoleum, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Even now, months later, the memory of that unearthly groan sends shivers down my spine. What the hell was that thing? I've racked my brain trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing makes sense. It wasn't human, that much I'm sure of, and it certainly wasn't alive in any normal sense of the word. Since that night, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Everywhere I go, I can't shake the sensation of unseen eyes following my every move. I find myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, heart pounding, expecting to see that same ghastly figure lurking in the shadows. I've even started having vivid, disturbing dreams about the cemetery. In these nightmares, I'm back on patrol, the icy wind whipping through the bare branches of the trees. The ground beneath my feet begins to tremble, and suddenly the earth splits open, decaying hands clawing their way up from the graves. Skeletal figures, still clad in the tattered remnants of their burial shrouds, rise up all around me, their hollow eyes boring into my soul. I try to run, but my legs feel heavy, as if weighed down by an unseen force. The undead creatures close in, their rotting fingers reaching out to grasp me. I can smell the stench of decay, hear the sickening sounds of bones cracking and flesh tearing. And then I see it, that same twisted, shambling figure from the mausoleum, leading the horde of the undead. It lets out a bone-chilling howl, and the others join in, the cacophony of inhuman shrieks echoing through the graveyard. I'm paralyzed with fear, unable to move as they surround me, closing in for the kill. I always wake with a start, drenched in a cold sweat. The dreams feel so real, so vivid, that I can't help but wonder if they're not just the product of my imagination. What if they're glimpses into a darker, more sinister reality? Something is happening at Willow Grove Cemetery, something beyond the realm of the natural world. Those graves aren't being disturbed by mere vandals or grave robbers. No, there's a far more malevolent force at work here. And I can't shake the feeling that I'm somehow connected to it all, that I'm being drawn back to that cursed place against my will. I've tried to put it all behind me to move on with my life. But the more I try to forget, the more the memories haunt me. The more I learn to fear the darkness and what might be lurking within it. I know I need to go back to confront whatever evil resides in that graveyard. I have to know the truth, even if the cost is my own sanity. The thought terrifies me, but there's a part of me that's also intrigued. What if I uncover something truly otherworldly, something that could change the way we view the world? The rational part of my mind tells me I'm being foolish, that I should just let the past stay buried. But the curious, restless part of me won't let it go. I have to know what's happening at Willow Grove Cemetery. I have to know the truth, no matter how dark and unsettling it may be. So I've made a decision. I'm going back to the graveyard, back to where this all began. I don't know what I'll find, or what horrors might be waiting for me. But I have to try. I have to uncover the secrets of the graveyard shift, even if it means staring death in the face once again. Wish me luck, my friends. And if you never hear from me again, well, I suppose that will speak volumes. The unknown awaits, and I'm about to dive head first into the abyss. God help me. As I step back through the rusted gates of Willow Grove Cemetery, a thick, ominous fog had settled over the grounds, obscuring my vision and making the towering headstones seem to loom. Out of the mist like spectral figures, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a sense of dread and apprehension weighing heavily in the air. I gripped the flashlight in my trembling hand, its beam cutting through the swirling fog as I made my way down the winding path, the soles of my shoes crunching on the gravel. The further I ventured into the cemetery, the thicker the fog became, until I could barely make out the shapes of the tombstones just a few feet in front of me. Suddenly, a sound reached my ears, a faint, guttural moaning that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, straining to locate the source of the unearthly noise. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the old mausoleum, that same structure where I'd witnessed the horror all those months ago. Stealing my nerves, I slowly made my way towards the mausoleum, the beam of my flashlight dancing across the cracked and crumbling stonework. As I approached, the moaning grew louder, more insistent, until it was a cacophony of inhuman wails that set my teeth on edge. When I reached the mausoleum, I could see that the heavy door was slightly ajar, just as I remembered. An icy chill swept through me, and for a moment I found myself rooted to the spot, torn between my curiosity and the overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to consume me. But I had to know. I had to see what was happening, what unholy forces were at work in this cursed place. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I slowly pushed the door open, the ancient hinges creaking in protest. The dim interior of the mausoleum was illuminated by a faint, eerie glow, not the warm, comforting light of my flashlight, but a cold, unearthly luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. And there, in the center of the chamber, was the source of the horrific moaning. A figure stood hunched over, its twisted, skeletal form barely resembling that of a human being. Tattered, decaying flesh clung to its frame, and as it turned towards me, I caught a glimpse of its sunken, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into the very depths of my soul. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but I was paralyzed with a terror I had never known. The creature let out a bone-chilling wail, its jaw unhinged as if to swallow me whole. And then, to my horror, I saw that it was not alone. All around the chamber, the walls seemed to writhe and shift, as if the very stones were coming alive. Skeletal hands burst forth from the cracks and crevices, grasping at the air with bony fingers. Sunken, hollow-eyed faces emerged from the darkness, mouths agape and silent, eternal screams. I was surrounded, trapped in a nightmare come to life. The undead horde converged on me, their twisted, decaying limbs reaching out to claim me as one of their own. I could smell the stench of decay, feel the cold, clammy touch of their flesh as they closed in, their moans and wails echoing through the chamber like a symphony of the damned. In that moment, I knew that I was facing something far beyond the realm of the natural world, a force of pure, unadulterated evil that defied all logic and reason. And as the darkness threatened to swallow me, I couldn't help but wonder. Is this how it all ends? Am I doomed to join the ranks of the undead, trapped in this cursed place for all eternity? The bony fingers of the creatures were closing in, their decaying flesh brushing against my skin, and I fought the overwhelming urge to vomit at the sheer revulsion of their touch. The moans and wails echoed all around me, a symphony of pure horror that burrowed into the deepest, darkest recesses of my mind. In a desperate last-ditch effort, I swung my flashlight wildly, the beam of light cutting through the gloom and eliciting a chorus of unearthly screeches from the creatures. They recoiled, their skeletal frames reeling back, and I seized the opportunity to make a break for the exit. I don't know how I managed to find the door, my vision blurred with pure terror, but somehow I stumbled out into the fog-shrouded graveyard, the heavy door slamming shut behind me. I ran, my lungs burning, legs aching, until I reached the outer gates, collapsing to my knees as I gasped for air. But the respite was short-lived. Even as I tried to catch my breath, a new, even more unsettling sound reached my ears. The faint but unmistakable sound of movement, of something stirring beneath the earth. I whipped my head around, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the tombstones, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The ground was shifting, the soil trembling, as if something was pushing its way up from below. And then, one by one, skeletal hands began to emerge, clawing their way up through the soft earth. Slowly, agonizingly, the undead were rising from their graves, their hollow eyes fixed on me with an unwavering, predatory gaze. I scrambled to my feet, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I found myself rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the sheer horror of what was unfolding before me. The creatures were pulling themselves up, their rotting flesh peeling away to reveal the grim, unforgiving truth. Death had no hold on them. And then, from the center of the graveyard, a figure began to take shape, emerging from the swirling fog like a harbinger of doom. It was the same twisted, shambling creature I had encountered before, its sunken eyes burning with a malevolent, unearthly light. It let out a bone-chilling howl, and the other undead creatures responded in kind, their cries echoing through the night like the wails of the damned. I knew then that I was in the presence of something truly ancient, something that defied all rational explanation. This was no mere haunting, no simple restless spirits. This was a force of pure evil, a malevolent entity that had seized control of the very fabric of death itself. As the creatures began to advance, their bony limbs reaching out towards me, I knew that I was running out of time. I had to get out of here, Had to find a way to escape this nightmare before it was too late. But part of me also knew that I could never truly outrun the darkness that had taken root in this cursed place. The only question was, would I be the next to join the ranks of the undead, trapped in an eternal dance of death and decay? Or would I somehow find a way to break the hold of this ancient evil, to uncover the secrets that lurked beneath the soil of Willow Grove Cemetery? I steeled my nerves, gripping the flashlight tightly in my hand. Whatever happened next, I knew I had to face it head on. The unknown stretched out before me, a vast, uncharted territory of horror and despair. But I was determined to confront it, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, I turned and ran, the swirling fog swallowing me up as I fled into the night, the unearthly wails of the undead creatures echoing in my ears. The journey ahead would be fraught with peril, but I had no choice but to see it through. The secrets of the graveyard shift were waiting to be uncovered, and I was the only one who could unravel the twisted, malevolent truth. As I ran through the fog-shrouded graveyard, my lungs burning and my heart pounding in my ears, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The unearthly howls of the undead creatures had faded into the distance, but the sense of dread that had settled over me refused to subside. I risked a glance over my shoulder, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the tombstones, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck continued to stand on end, a nagging sensation that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. Steeling my nerves, I pressed on, my feet pounding against the gravel path as I made my way towards the exit. But just as I was nearing the gates, a new sound reached my ears, a low, guttural growl, like the rumbling of some primordial beast. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Slowly, I turned, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog, and what I saw made my heart skip a beat. There, emerging from the mist, was a hulking, monstrous figure, its eyes glowing with an unearthly, predatory light. It was not like the other undead creatures I had encountered. This thing was far larger, its frame twisted and distorted, its limbs contorted into unnatural, spider-like appendages. Its mouth was a gaping maw of sharp, jagged teeth, dripping with a viscous, foul-smelling saliva. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen in terror, but I found myself rooted to the spot, my body betraying the panic that gripped my mind. The creature let out another menacing growl, its glowing eyes fixed on me with a hunger that sent a shiver down my spine. Slowly, it began to advance, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if its very bones were shifting and transforming beneath its rotting flesh. I could hear the cracking and popping of its joints, the sound echoing through the graveyard like the snapping of twigs. I knew I had to get out of there, had to find a way to escape this nightmare. But as I turned to flee, I realized to my horror that the creature was not alone. All around me, the fog was beginning to thicken, and from within it, I could see the silhouettes of more monstrous figures, their glowing eyes and gnashing teeth emerging from the swirling mist. I was surrounded, trapped in a living nightmare. The creatures closed in, their twisted, deformed limbs reaching out towards me, their guttural growls and snarls filling the air. I could smell their foul, rotten stench, feel the cold, clammy touch of their decaying flesh as they drew nearer. In a desperate last-ditch effort, I swung my flashlight wildly, the beam of light momentarily driving the creatures back. But I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. These were not the mindless, shambling undead I had encountered before. These were something else entirely, something far more primal and terrifying. As I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized that I was running out of options. The gates were still too far away, and the creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes and gnashing teeth a constant, looming presence. I had to find another way out, another avenue of escape, before they overwhelmed me. My mind raced, searching for any possible solution, any glimmer of hope in the face of this unrelenting horror. And then, in the distance, I caught sight of something that sent a new wave of dread coursing through me. There, just beyond the reach of the creatures, was the old mausoleum. The very same structure that had harbored the first of the undead abominations I had encountered. And standing before it, as if guarding the entrance, was the twisted, shambling figure I had seen before, its hollow eyes fixed on me with a malevolent, unwavering gaze. I was trapped, with nowhere left to turn. The monstrous creatures were closing in, their guttural snarls and growls echoing all around me, and the dark, foreboding presence of the mausoleum loomed over me like a harbinger of doom. In that moment, I knew that I was facing a darkness that went beyond the realm of the natural world, a force of pure evil that defied all logic and reason. And as the creatures drew nearer, their twisted, deformed limbs reaching out to claim me, I couldn't help but wonder. And as the creatures drew nearer, their twisted, deformed limbs reaching out to claim me, I couldn't help but wonder, is this truly the end? Have I stumbled upon a darkness so profound, so unrelenting, that there can be no escape? The creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes and gaping maws filled with a primal, savage hunger. I could feel the cold, clammy touch of their decaying flesh as they reached for me, their guttural snarls and growls echoing through the graveyard like the cries of the damned. But even as I braced myself for the inevitable, a glimmer of hope flickered in the back of my mind. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way out of this nightmare, a path that could lead me to safety and maybe even uncover the truth that lay at the heart of this ancient, unspeakable evil. Steeling my nerves, I darted my gaze around the graveyard, searching for any possible avenue of escape. The mausoleum loomed before me, its ominous presence a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked within. But there, just to the left of the crumbling structure, I caught sight of a narrow, overgrown path, barely visible through the swirling fog. Without hesitation, I turned and sprinted towards the path, my legs pumping furiously as I pushed through the thick brush and tangled vines. The creatures let out a collective roar of frustration, their heavy footsteps thundering behind me as they gave chase. I could feel the cold, clammy touch of their decaying hands reaching out, their sharp nails grazing the back of my neck. The panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I refused to give in, pushing myself harder, faster, desperate to reach the relative safety of the path. As I emerged onto the narrow, winding trail, I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my heart sank. The creatures had not been deterred, their hulking forms surging forward, their glowing eyes fixed on me with a predatory intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I had to keep moving, had to find a way to lose them in the labyrinth of twisting pathways and overgrown vegetation. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I pressed on, my lungs burning with the exertion, the beam of light dancing across the uneven ground as I navigated the treacherous terrain. The creatures were relentless, their guttural snarls and growls echoing all around me, a constant, chilling reminder of the peril I faced. I could feel their presence closing in, the weight of their malevolent gaze bearing down on me with every step. And then, as I rounded a sharp corner, I caught sight of something that made my heart skip a beat, a small, weathered signpost, its faded lettering barely visible in the dim light. Willow Grove Mausoleum. It read, the words sending a fresh wave of dread coursing through me. I hesitated, my mind racing. Should I risk delving deeper into the heart of this cursed place, where the undead abominations first emerged, or should I seek an alternative path? One that might lead me away from the horrors that lurked within the mausoleum's ancient walls. The creatures were closing in, their guttural snarls echoing through the night, and I knew I had no choice but to make a decision. To turn back would be to face certain doom, but to venture forward into the unknown. With a deep, steadying breath, I steeled my nerves and pressed on, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom as I made my way towards the mausoleum, the sound of the creature's pursuit hot on my heels. I knew that I was heading straight into the heart of the darkness, but something deep within me urged me forward, a relentless curiosity that refused to be extinguished. As I neared the mausoleum, The air grew thick with a palpable sense of foreboding, a heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to seep into my very bones. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the very walls of the ancient structure were alive with a malevolent, unseen force. Gripping my flashlight tighter, I slowly pushed the heavy door open, the ancient hinges creaking in protest. The dim, eerie glow that had previously illuminated the interior was gone, replaced by an inky, all-consuming darkness that sent a chill down my spine. I paused, my heart pounding in my ears, straining to discern any sound, any movement that might betray the presence of the undead horrors that lurked within. But the silence was deafening, broken only by the faint echo of my own breathing and the distant, ominous howls of the creatures that pursued me. Summoning my courage, I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The chamber was as I remembered it, the crumbling walls and ancient sarcophagi casting long, twisted shadows. But there, in the center of the room, was something new, a strange, pulsating energy that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. I approached cautiously, the beam of my light dancing across the surface of the sarcophagi, searching for any sign of the twisted, skeletal figures that had terrorized me before. But the chamber remained eerily silent, save for the faint, unsettling hum that grew louder with every step I took. As I drew closer to the source of the pulsating energy, I began to make out a faint, flickering light. Not the warm, comforting glow of my flashlight, but a cold, unearthly luminescence that seemed to emanate from within the sarcophagus itself. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers brushing against the ancient, crumbling stone, and a jolt of pure, raw energy shot through me, causing me to recoil in shock and horror. In that moment, the silence was shattered by a deafening, bone-chilling roar, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the mausoleum, shaking the very foundations of the ancient structure. I whirled around, my flashlight sweeping across the chamber, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The creatures had breached the doorway, their hulking, deformed frames spilling into the chamber, their glowing eyes fixed on me with a primal, savage hunger. And there, at the forefront of the horde, was the twisted, shambling figure I had encountered before, its hollow eyes burning with a malevolent, otherworldly light. I was trapped, surrounded by the unholy abominations, their guttural snarls and growls echoing all around me. And as I backed away, the pulsating energy from the sarcophagus seemed to grow stronger, its cold, unearthly light casting an eerie glow across the chamber. I knew in that moment that I had stumbled upon something far beyond the realm of the natural world, a force of pure, unrelenting evil that defied all logic and reason. And as the creatures closed in, their twisted, deformed limbs reaching out to claim me, I couldn't help but wonder. As the creatures closed in, their twisted, deformed limbs reaching out to claim me, I couldn't help but wonder what unspeakable horrors lay in store. What dark, malevolent forces had I awakened, and what nightmarish consequences would I now have to face? In a desperate bid for survival, I scanned the room, searching for any means of escape, any glimmer of hope in the face of this unrelenting darkness. But the creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes and gaping maws filled with a primal, savage hunger that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, as if in response to my frantic search, the pulsating energy emanating from the ancient sarcophagus began to intensify, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber. The creatures paused, their movements stilling as they turned their attention towards the source of this strange, unsettling power. Seizing the opportunity, I backed away, my eyes darting between the monstrous figures and the glowing sarcophagus, my mind racing to piece together the twisted, tangled web of this unholy mystery. What dark secrets were contained within that ancient, crumbling tomb, and why had the creatures been drawn to its pulsating energy? As I retreated, the creatures let out a collective, bone-chilling roar, their hunger temporarily overpowered by a primal, instinctive fear. They advanced slowly, their movements cautious and deliberate, their glowing eyes fixed on the sarcophagus with a mix of trepidation and raw, unrestrained curiosity. I watched, transfixed, as the creatures circled the ancient tomb, their twisted, deformed limbs reaching out to touch its surface, as if seeking to commune with the power that dwelled within. The air crackled with an electric tension, the very atmosphere of the chamber thick with a palpable sense of foreboding. And then, without warning, the sarcophagus began to tremble, the pulsating energy surging forth in a blinding flash of light. The creatures let out a collective, agonizing howl, their forms convulsing as the energy seemed to wash over them, penetrating their very being. I shielded my eyes, the glare of the light searing my retinas, and when the intensity finally began to subside, I slowly lowered my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw next made my blood run cold. The creatures were changing, their twisted, deformed limbs shifting and contorting, their very flesh and bones seemingly melting and reforming before my eyes. The roars and snarls that had once filled the chamber had given way to an eerie, unsettling silence, broken only by the faint, guttural sounds of the creatures as they underwent their horrific transformation. I watched, transfixed, as their bodies elongated, their limbs thinning and lengthening, their once monstrous features becoming more human-like, yet still deeply, profoundly wrong. And then, one by one, the creatures turned their attention towards me, their hollow, soulless eyes burning with a malevolent, otherworldly light. I felt a cold, icy grip of fear take hold of my heart, for I knew in that moment that I was no longer facing mere undead abominations. These were something far, far worse. They began to advance, their movements no longer the clumsy, shambling gait of the zombies I had encountered, but a fluid, predatory grace that sent a shiver down my spine. I backed away, my legs trembling, my mind racing to comprehend the true nature of the horrors that had been unleashed within this cursed mausoleum. As I retreated, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, and my heart nearly stopped. There, emerging from the shadows, was the twisted, shambling figure I had seen before. But it was no longer the same. Its form had undergone a similar transformation, its once skeletal frame now more human-like, yet still deeply, profoundly unsettling. I watched in a mix of horror and fascination as the creature approached, its movements fluid and graceful, its hollow eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence that I had never before encountered. It let out a low, guttural hiss, and the other transformed creatures responded in kind, their voices blending together in a chilling, otherworldly symphony. I knew then that I was facing something far more dangerous than the mindless, shambling undead I had encountered earlier. These creatures, whatever they had become, were now imbued with a dark, sinister intelligence, a malevolent consciousness that seemed to transcend the boundaries of the natural world. As they closed in, their movements eerily fluid and precise, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Whatever had transpired here, whatever dark secrets lay buried within the ancient sarcophagus, had irrevocably altered the very nature of these creatures, transforming them into something far more terrifying, far more insatiable than I could have ever imagined. The pulsating energy within the sarcophagus continued to thrum, a constant, unsettling reminder of the dark, unseen forces that had been unleashed. I knew that I had to find a way to escape, to uncover the truth behind this unholy mystery before it was too late. But as the transformed creatures surrounded me, their hollow eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to pierce my very soul, I couldn't help but wonder. I couldn't help but wonder if I had finally reached the end of my harrowing journey. If this was the moment where the darkness that had been pursuing me would finally claim its prize. The transformed creatures circled me, their movements fluid and precise, their hollow eyes burning with an insatiable hunger that sent chills down my spine. I could feel the weight of their malevolent gaze, the palpable aura of menace that seemed to permeate the very air around me. And then, as if in response to their predatory advance, the pulsating energy within the ancient sarcophagus suddenly surged, the cold, unearthly light pulsing with a frenetic intensity. The creatures paused, their attention momentarily diverted, and I knew that this might be my only chance to escape. Without a moment's hesitation, I turned and fled, my legs pumping furiously as I darted through the shadowy confines of the mausoleum. The creatures let out a collective, bone-chilling roar, their pursuit swiftly resuming as they gave chase. Their fluid, graceful movements a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the undead I had faced before. I could feel their presence closing in, the pounding of their footsteps echoing through the chamber, the sound of their guttural snarls and hisses sending a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. I knew that I couldn't outrun them for long, that my only hope lay in finding a way to lose them in the labyrinth of crumbling corridors and twisting passageways. As I rounded a sharp corner, I caught sight of a glimmer of light in the distance, a faint, flickering glow that held the promise of an exit, of a means of escape from this living nightmare. Summoning every ounce of my strength, I pushed forward, my lungs burning with the exertion, the sound of the creature's pursuit growing ever closer. And then, just as I reached the threshold of the chamber, a new, unexpected horror presented itself. There, standing before the exit, was the twisted, shambling figure I had encountered earlier, but it was no longer the same. Its form had undergone a transformation, its once skeletal frame now more human-like, yet still deeply, profoundly unsettling. The creature let out a low, guttural hiss, and I could feel the weight of its hollow, malevolent gaze upon me. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, as the other transformed creatures converged behind me, their fluid movements cutting off any hope of retreat. I was trapped, surrounded by these inhuman abominations, their hungry, predatory gazes burning into me. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus continued to thrum, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber, as if the very walls were alive with a malevolent, unseen force. And then, as the transformed creatures began to close in, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. There, amidst the shadows, I glimpsed movement, a figure that seemed to shift and undulate, its form blurring and shifting in a way that defied all rational explanation. I watched, transfixed, as the figure emerged from the gloom, its features distorted and contorted, its very essence seeming to defy the laws of nature. It let out a bone-chilling, unearthly wail, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the mausoleum, shaking the ancient structure to its core. The transformed creatures recoiled, their movements faltering, their hollow eyes filled with a mix of fear and reverence. And as the figure drew closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that this was no mere undead abomination. This was something far, far more sinister, a force of pure, unadulterated evil that had been unleashed from the depths of the ancient sarcophagus. I backed away, my legs trembling, my mind racing as I tried to comprehend the true nature of the horror that now confronted me. The very air seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of dread and foreboding that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, without warning, the figure lashed out, its twisted, deformed limbs moving with a speed and ferocity that defied all logic. I barely had time to react before it was upon me, its icy, clammy touch searing my flesh, its hollow, inhuman gaze piercing my very soul. I cried out in pain and terror, my voice joining the unearthly chorus of the transformed creatures, as the figure's grip tightened around me, its malevolent power threatening to consume me. I could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of its malignant presence bearing down upon me. And I knew that I was facing a force that transcended all mortal comprehension. As the figure's icy grip tightened, I felt a familiar sensation. The pulsating energy from the ancient sarcophagus was growing stronger, its cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber. And in that moment, I realized with a sinking feeling that the true horror was only just beginning. And in that moment, I realized with a sinking feeling that the true horror was only just beginning. The figure's grip tightened, its icy, clammy touch burning my flesh, and I could feel the darkness seeping into my very being, a malevolent presence that threatened to consume me from within. The pulsating energy from the ancient sarcophagus grew stronger, its cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber. The transformed creatures, once mere shambling undead, now stood transfixed, their hollow eyes reflecting a mix of reverence and fear, as if they were in the presence of some unspeakable, otherworldly power. I struggled against the figure's grasp, my limbs growing heavy and unresponsive, the weight of its malignant power bearing down upon me. The sound of my own labored breathing echoed in my ears, mingling with the guttural, unsettling hisses and growls of the transformed creatures. And then, as if in response to my futile attempts at escape, the figure let out a bone-chilling, unearthly wail, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the mausoleum, shaking the ancient structure to its core. The transformed creatures recoiled, their fluid movements faltering, their hollow eyes widening with a primal, instinctive fear. I watched, transfixed, as the figure's form began to shift and contort, its very essence blurring and undulating in a way that defied all rational explanation. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light pulsing with a frenetic intensity, and I knew that I was witnessing the unleashing of a force that was beyond mortal comprehension. As the figure's transformation continued, I could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of its malignant presence bearing down upon me with a crushing, suffocating force. The air seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of dread and foreboding that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, without warning, the figure lashed out, its twisted, deformed limbs moving with a speed and ferocity that defied all logic. I cried out in pain and terror as its icy, clammy touch burned my flesh, its hollow, inhuman gaze piercing my very soul. The transformed creatures, once mere spectators, now seemed to be drawn into the maelstrom of this unholy power, their fluid movements and predatory grace becoming increasingly frenzied and erratic. They converged upon me, their hollow eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. I fought against their relentless assault, my limbs growing heavy and unresponsive, the weight of the darkness bearing down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force. And as the figure's transformation reached its climax, I caught a glimpse of a sight that would be seared into my memory for eternity. The figure's form had become something other, its very essence defying all rational explanation. It was a being of pure, unadulterated evil, a force of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the universe itself. And as it turned its gaze upon me, I felt a chill run down my spine, a primal, instinctive terror that threatened to consume me. The transformed creatures, now seemingly under the thrall of this unholy power, surged forward, their fluid, graceful movements a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the undead I had faced before. I knew that I was no match for their combined might, that my only hope lay in somehow breaking free of the figure's grip and finding a way to escape this living nightmare. But as I struggled against the darkness that threatened to consume me, a new, unexpected horror presented itself. From the shadows, a horde of twisted, distorted figures emerged, their forms blurred and indistinct, their movements erratic and unpredictable. I watched in horrified fascination as they converged upon the transformed creatures, their attacks savage and relentless, as if driven by a primal, insatiable hunger. The chamber erupted into a maelstrom of violence, the air thick with the sounds of snarls, growls, and agonizing screams. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus continued to thrum, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the scene, as if the very walls were alive with a malevolent, unseen force. And amidst the chaos, the figure that had held me in its icy grip seemed to grow in power, its very presence radiating a dark, sinister energy that threatened to consume everything in its path. I could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of its malignant presence bearing down upon me, and I knew that I was facing a force that transcended all mortal comprehension. As the battle raged on, I realized with a growing sense of dread that my only hope of survival might lie in somehow aligning myself with the transformed creatures, in finding a way to harness the power that had been unleashed from the ancient sarcophagus. But the risk was immense, for I knew that to do so would be to flirt with the very forces of darkness that threatened to consume me. The decision weighed heavily upon me, the stakes impossibly high. And as the transformed creatures and the twisted, distorted figures continued their savage, relentless assault, I knew that I had to act, that I had to make a choice that would determine the course of my harrowing journey. The decision weighed heavily upon me, the stakes impossibly high. And as the transformed creatures and the twisted, distorted figures continued their savage, relentless assault, I knew that I had to act, that I had to make a choice that would determine the course of my harrowing journey. With a surge of adrenaline, I mustered what little strength I had left and managed to break free from the figure's grip. The malevolent entity let out a bone-chilling, unearthly wail, its hollow, inhuman gaze fixed upon me with a hunger that seemed to pierce my very soul. I stumbled backwards, my legs trembling, as the transformed creatures and the twisted, distorted figures turned their attention towards me. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the pulsating force from the ancient sarcophagus pulsing with a frenetic intensity, and I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a cataclysmic confrontation. In that moment, I made a decision that would forever haunt me. I turned towards the transformed creatures, my heart pounding in my chest, and reached out, my hand trembling, towards the nearest one. The creature paused, its hollow eyes narrowing, as if sensing the gravity of my gesture. And then, to my utter astonishment, the creature responded, its movements fluid and precise, as it reached out and grasped my hand. A surge of power coursed through me, the pulsating energy from the sarcophagus flooding my senses, and I felt a connection forming, a twisted, unnatural bond that transcended the bounds of the natural world. The transformed creatures, once my sworn enemies, now seemed to recognize me as an ally. Their savage, relentless assault momentarily halted. The twisted, distorted figures, sensing the shift in the balance of power, hesitated, their movements erratic and unpredictable. In that moment, I knew that I had to seize the opportunity, that I had to harness the power that had been unleashed from the ancient sarcophagus and use it to my advantage. But the risk was immense, for I knew that to do so would be to flirt with the very forces of darkness that threatened to consume me. As I stood there, my hand clasped in the grip of the transformed creature, I could feel the malevolent energy pulsing through me, the weight of the darkness bearing down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force. The figure that had held me in its icy grip now watched from the shadows, its hollow, inhuman gaze fixed upon me with a hunger that seemed to transcend all mortal comprehension. I knew that I was standing at a crossroads, that the choice I made in this moment would shape the course of my harrowing journey. The transformed creatures, once my sworn enemies, now seemed to offer a glimmer of hope, a chance to confront the unspeakable horrors that had been unleashed from the ancient sarcophagus. But the risk was immense, for to align myself with these twisted, unnatural beings would be to invite the very darkness that threatened to consume me. The figure in the shadows, its power growing with every passing moment, loomed over the scene, a constant, unsettling reminder of the true nature of the evil that I now faced. As the transformed creatures and the twisted, distorted figures continued their savage, relentless assault, I knew that I had to make a choice, to embrace the power of the sarcophagus and confront the darkness head-on, or to turn my back and flee, abandoning any hope of uncovering the truth behind this unholy mystery. The air crackled with tension, the pulsating energy from the ancient tomb pulsing with a frenetic intensity, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched to its breaking point. I could feel the weight of the decision bearing down upon me, the stakes impossibly high, and I knew that whatever choice I made would irrevocably alter the course of my life. And as I stood there, my hand clasped in the grip of the transformed creature, I could feel the malevolent energy coursing through me, the darkness seeping into my very being. The figure in the shadows watched, its hollow, inhuman gaze fixed upon me, and I knew that I was facing a force that transcended all mortal comprehension. The choice before me was clear, but the cost was unimaginable. I could feel the power of the sarcophagus calling to me, the promise of unimaginable strength and knowledge tempting me to embrace the darkness. But I also knew that to do so would be to risk my very soul, to invite the very forces of evil that threatened to consume me. As the transformed creatures and the twisted, distorted figures continued their savage, relentless assault, I steeled my resolve, knowing that the future of this cursed place, and perhaps the world itself, hung in the balance. With a deep breath, I made my choice, fully aware that the consequences would be dire, and that the nightmare I had stumbled upon was only just beginning. With a deep breath, I made my choice, fully aware that the consequences would be dire, and that the nightmare I had stumbled upon was only just beginning. I tightened my grip on the transformed creature's hand, feeling the surge of power coursing through me, and turned to face the horde of twisted, distorted figures that loomed before me. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy, the pulsating force from the ancient sarcophagus pulsing with a frenetic intensity. The transformed creatures, once my sworn enemies, now stood by my side, their fluid, graceful movements a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the undead I had faced before. As the twisted, distorted figures advanced, I could feel the weight of the darkness bearing down upon me, the malevolent presence of the figure in the shadows looming ever closer. But with the power of the sarcophagus coursing through me, I knew that I was no longer helpless, that I had the means to confront this unholy evil head-on. The transformed creatures surged forward, their attacks savage and relentless, as they engaged the twisted, distorted figures in a brutal, unforgiving melee. The air was filled with the sounds of snarls, growls, and agonizing screams, the chamber erupting into a maelstrom of violence that threatened to tear the very fabric of reality asunder. I stood at the center of the chaos, my hand outstretched, channeling the pulsating energy from the sarcophagus into a devastating display of power. Bolts of unearthly energy crackled from my fingertips, striking the twisted, distorted figures with a force that seemed to bend the laws of nature itself. The transformed creatures, empowered by my newfound abilities, fought with a ferocity that was almost inhuman, their fluid movements and sharp, jagged claws tearing through the flesh of their adversaries with a savage, unrelenting fury. But even as we pushed back the horde of twisted, distorted figures, I could sense the growing presence of the figure in the shadows, its hollow, inhuman gaze fixed upon me with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. The malevolent entity seemed to be drawing strength from the very chaos it had unleashed, its power growing with every passing moment. I knew that I could not afford to be distracted, that I had to keep my focus trained on the immediate threat before me. The transformed creatures continued their relentless assault, their movements swift and precise, as they carved a path of destruction through the ranks of the twisted, distorted figures. But as the battle raged on, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. There was something about the figure in the shadows, something deeply unsettling and foreboding, that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. I could feel its malevolent presence seeping into my very being, a darkness that threatened to consume me from within. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus continued to thrum, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the scene. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and I knew that the true horror was yet to be revealed, that the forces I had unleashed were only the beginning of a much larger, more terrifying reckoning. As the transformed creatures and the twisted, distorted figures continued their savage, relentless battle, I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a palpable sense of foreboding that sent a chill down my spine. The figure in the shadows, once a distant, looming presence, now seemed to be moving, its fluid, graceful movements a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the undead. I watched, transfixed, as the figure emerged from the gloom, its features distorted and contorted, its very essence seeming to defy the laws of nature. It let out a bone-chilling, unearthly wail, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the mausoleum, shaking the ancient structure to its core. The transformed creatures, their attention momentarily diverted, faltered in their assault, their hollow eyes widening with a primal, instinctive fear. And as the figure drew closer, I realized with a sinking feeling that this was no mere undead abomination. This was something far more sinister, a force of pure, unadulterated evil that had been unleashed from the depths of the ancient sarcophagus. I could feel the weight of the figure's malevolent gaze upon me, its hollow, inhuman eyes boring into my very soul. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light pulsing with a frenetic intensity, and I knew that I was facing a power that transcended all mortal comprehension. The transformed creatures, once my allies, now seemed to cower in the presence of this unholy entity, their fluid movements faltering, their savage, relentless assault grinding to a halt. I stood alone, facing the full force of this malevolent, otherworldly presence, and I knew that the true test of my newfound power was about to begin. I stood alone, facing the full force of this malevolent, otherworldly presence, and I knew that the true test of my newfound power was about to begin. The figure in the shadows moved with a fluid, graceful motion that seemed to defy the laws of physics, its twisted, distorted form a chilling sight to behold. As it drew closer, I could feel the weight of its malevolent gaze upon me, the darkness seeping into my very being. The pulsating energy from the ancient sarcophagus continued to thrum, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber, as if the very walls were alive with a sinister, unseen force. The transformed creatures, once my allies, now cowered in fear, their hollow eyes reflecting a mix of reverence and terror. The twisted, distorted figures that had been the focus of our previous battle had vanished, leaving me to face this unholy entity alone, and I knew that the stakes had never been higher. The figure's movements were mesmerizing, its form blurring and undulating in a way that defied all rational explanation. I could feel the power radiating from it, a malevolent energy that threatened to consume me from within. The air crackled with an unseen force, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unspeakable evil. As the figure drew closer, I could make out the details of its twisted, distorted features, a grotesque amalgamation of human and inhuman elements that sent a chill down my spine. Its hollow, inhuman gaze fixed upon me, and I felt a surge of primal, instinctive terror that threatened to overwhelm me. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this unholy entity, but the weight of the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force. The transformed creatures, once my allies, now huddled in the shadows, their fluid movements reduced to a trembling, fearful stillness. The figure's presence seemed to fill the chamber, the very air thick with a palpable sense of dread and foreboding. I could feel the darkness closing in, the malevolent energy seeping into my very being, and I knew that I was facing a force that transcended all mortal comprehension. As the figure reached out with its twisted, deformed limbs, I steeled my resolve, channeling the pulsating energy from the sarcophagus into a desperate, last-ditch effort to repel the impending attack. Bolts of unearthly energy crackled from my fingertips, striking the figure with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mausoleum. The figure recoiled, its unearthly wail echoing through the chamber, and for a moment, I dared to hope that I had found the strength to confront this malevolent entity. But as the figure regained its footing, I realized with a sinking feeling that my efforts had barely made a dent, that the true extent of its power was only just beginning to be revealed. The transformed creatures, sensing the shift in the balance of power, surged forward, their fluid movements once again imbued with a savage, relentless fury. But as they clashed with the figure, I could see that their attacks were having little to no effect, the malevolent entity brushing them aside with a casual, effortless grace. I watched, transfixed, as the figure began to shift and contort, its very essence blurring and undulating in a way that defied all rational explanation. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light pulsing with a frenetic intensity, and I knew that I was witnessing the unleashing of a force that was beyond mortal comprehension. The transformed creatures faltered, their savage, relentless assault grinding to a halt as they fell under the thrall of this unholy power. I could feel the darkness closing in, the weight of the figure's malevolent presence bearing down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force, and I knew that I was facing a threat that threatened to consume not just me, but the very fabric of the world itself. As the figure's transformation continued, I could feel the very air crackle with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of dread and foreboding that threatened to overwhelm me. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus pulsed with a frenetic intensity, and I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a cataclysmic confrontation, one that would test the limits of my newfound power and push the boundaries of my very sanity. The transformed creatures, once my allies, now seemed to be drawn into the maelstrom of this unholy power, their fluid movements and predatory grace becoming increasingly frenzied and erratic. They converged upon the figure, their hollow eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. But their efforts were in vain, the malevolent entity brushing them aside with a casual, effortless grace. And as the figure's transformation reached its climax, I caught a glimpse of a sight that would be seared into my memory for eternity. The entity's form had become something other, its very essence defying all rational explanation. It was a being of pure, unadulterated evil, a force of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the universe itself. And as it turned its gaze upon me, I felt a chill run down my spine, a primal, instinctive terror that threatened to consume me. I felt a chill run down my spine, a primal, instinctive terror that threatened to consume me. The figure's gaze seemed to pierce through my very soul, and I could feel the weight of its malevolent presence bearing down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force. As the transformed creatures continued their frenzied, futile assault, I watched in a mixture of awe and horror as the figure's form continued to shift and contort, its very essence defying all rational explanation. The pulsating energy from the ancient sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber, as if the very walls were alive with a sinister, unseen force. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. I could feel the darkness closing in, the malevolent presence seeping into my very being, and I knew that I was facing a threat that transcended all mortal comprehension. The transformed creatures, once my allies, now appeared to be little more than pawns in the figure's twisted, malevolent game. Their savage, relentless attacks were brushed aside with a casual, effortless grace, and I watched with a growing sense of dread as they were slowly, methodically consumed by the figure's unearthly power. As the transformed creatures fell, their agonizing screams echoing through the chamber, I felt a surge of desperation and fear. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this malevolent entity, but the weight of the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force. The figure's gaze remained fixed upon me, its hollow, inhuman eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to transcend all mortal comprehension. I could feel the darkness seeping into my very being, the malevolent energy threatening to consume me from within, and I knew that I was standing on the precipice of a cataclysmic confrontation. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus continued to thrum, the cold, unearthly light pulsing with a frenetic intensity. The very walls of the mausoleum seemed to shift and undulate, as if the structure itself was alive and reacting to the unleashing of this unholy power. I could feel the weight of the figure's presence bearing down upon me. The malevolent entity's fluid, graceful movements a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the transformed creatures that had once been my allies. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread and foreboding, and I knew that I was facing a threat that threatened to consume not just me, but the very fabric of the world itself. As the figure continued its transformation, I watched in a mixture of awe and terror as its form blurred and contorted, the very essence of its being defying all rational explanation. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus pulsed with a frenetic intensity, casting an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber, and I knew that I was witnessing the unleashing of a force that was beyond mortal comprehension. The transformed creatures, now little more than mindless, twisted abominations, continued their frenzied, futile assault, their hollow eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. But their efforts were in vain, the malevolent entity brushing them aside with a casual, effortless grace, as if they were nothing more than insignificant insects. I watched, transfixed, as the figure's transformation reached its climax, the very air crackling with an unseen energy that threatened to tear the very fabric of reality asunder. The pulsating force from the sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light pulsing with a frenetic intensity, and I knew that I was facing a threat that would test the limits of my newfound power and push the boundaries of my very sanity. The figure's gaze remained fixed upon me, its hollow, inhuman eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to transcend all mortal comprehension. I could feel the weight of its malevolent presence bearing down upon me, the darkness seeping into my very being, and I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a confrontation that would determine the very fate of the world. As the transformed creatures fell, their agonizing screams echoing through the chamber, I felt a surge of desperation and fear. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this malevolent entity, but the weight of the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force. The figure's form continued to shift and contort, its very essence blurring and undulating in a way that defied all rational explanation. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus cast an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber, and I knew that I was facing a threat that transcended all mortal comprehension. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. I could feel the darkness closing in, the malevolent presence seeping into my very being, and I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a cataclysmic confrontation, one that would determine the very fate of the world. I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a cataclysmic confrontation, one that would determine the very fate of the world. The figure's malevolent presence continued to loom over me, its twisted, distorted form a chilling sight to behold. The transformed creatures, now reduced to mindless, twisted abominations, continued their frenzied, futile assault, their hollow eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. As the figure's transformation reached its climax, I felt a surge of overwhelming terror that threatened to consume me from within. The pulsating energy from the ancient sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the chamber, as if the very walls were alive with a sinister, unseen force. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. I watched, transfixed, as the figure's form continued to shift and contort, its essence defying all rational explanation. The hollow, inhuman gaze that had been fixed upon me now seemed to bore into the very depths of my soul, and I felt a chill run down my spine, a primal, instinctive terror that threatened to consume me. The transformed creatures, once my allies, now lay motionless, their agonizing screams having long since faded into a haunting, eerie silence. The malevolent entity had brushed them aside with a casual, effortless grace, and I knew that I was facing a threat that transcended all mortal comprehension. The weight of the figure's presence bore down upon me, the darkness seeping into my very being. I could feel the malevolent energy threatening to consume me from within, and I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this unholy entity. But the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force, and I found myself paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the task before me. The chamber was filled with an unsettling, unearthly stillness, the only sound the faint, ominous hum of the pulsating energy from the sarcophagus. The cold, flickering light cast an eerie, distorted glow across the scene, and I could feel the weight of the figure's presence bearing down upon me. The malevolent entity's fluid, graceful movements a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the fallen transformed creatures. As I stood there, frozen in a mixture of fear and determination, I could sense a shift in the atmosphere, a palpable sense of dread and foreboding that threatened to overwhelm me. The very air seemed to thicken, the weight of the figure's malevolent presence bearing down upon me with an almost physical force. And then, as if in response to some unseen signal, the figure began to move once more, its twisted, distorted form blurring and undulating in a way that defied all rational explanation. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light pulsing with a frenetic intensity, and I knew that I was witnessing the unleashing of a force that was beyond mortal comprehension. The transformed creatures, now little more than twisted, lifeless husks, began to stir, their hollow eyes burning with a malevolent, unholy light. I watched transfixed as they converged upon the figure, their movements jerky and erratic, yet driven by a primal, instinctive hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. And as the figure and the transformed creatures clashed in a brutal, unforgiving melee, I felt a surge of both awe and terror. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus cast an eerie, flickering glow across the scene, and I knew that I was witnessing the unleashing of a force that would test the limits of my newfound power and push the boundaries of my very sanity. The figure's movements were mesmerizing, its fluid, graceful motions a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the transformed creatures. It seemed to move with a purpose, a malevolent intent that sent a chill down my spine. And as it turned its hollow, inhuman gaze upon me once more, I felt a surge of primal, instinctive terror that threatened to overwhelm me. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this unholy entity. But the weight of the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force, and I found myself paralyzed, torn between the desire to protect the world from this malevolent force and the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume me from within. The transformed creatures continued their frenzied, futile assault, their hollow eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. But their efforts were in vain, the figure brushing them aside with a casual, effortless grace, as if they were nothing more than insignificant insects. And as the figure turned its attention back to me, I felt a surge of desperation and fear. The malevolent presence seemed to fill the chamber, the very air thick with a palpable sense of dread and foreboding. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus pulsed with a frenetic intensity, and I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a confrontation that would determine the very fate of the world. I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a confrontation that would determine the very fate of the world. The figure's malevolent presence seemed to fill the chamber, the very air thick with a palpable sense of dread and foreboding. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus pulsed with a frenetic intensity, casting an eerie, flickering glow across the scene that made my skin crawl. As the figure turned its hollow, inhuman gaze upon me once more, I felt a surge of overwhelming terror that threatened to consume me from within. The transformed creatures, now little more than twisted, lifeless husks, continued their frenzied, futile assault, their movements jerky and erratic, yet driven by a primal, instinctive hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. I could feel the darkness seeping into my very being, the malevolent presence bearing down upon me with an almost physical force. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, distorted glow across the scene that made my heart race with terror. And then, as if in response to some unseen signal, the figure began to shift and contort once more, its twisted, distorted form blurring and undulating in a way that defied all rational explanation. The transformed creatures, sensing the shift in the balance of power, converged upon the figure with a renewed fervor, their hollow eyes burning with a malevolent, unholy light. I watched transfixed as the figure and the transformed creatures clashed in a brutal, unforgiving melee, their movements a blur of twisted, deformed limbs and guttural, inhuman screeches. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the pulsing energy of the sarcophagus, and I felt a surge of both awe and revulsion at the sheer, unearthly power that was being unleashed before me. The figure's movements were mesmerizing, its fluid, graceful motions a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the transformed creatures. It seemed to move with a purpose, a malevolent intent that sent a chill down my spine. And as it turned its attention back to me, I felt a surge of primal, instinctive terror that threatened to overwhelm me. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this unholy entity. But the weight of the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force, and I found myself paralyzed, torn between the desire to protect the world from this malevolent force and the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume me from within. The transformed creatures, now reduced to little more than twisted, lifeless husks, continued their frenzied, futile assault, their movements becoming increasingly erratic and desperate as the figure brushed them aside with a casual, effortless grace. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. And as the figure turned its attention back to me, I felt a surge of desperation and fear. The malevolent presence seemed to fill the chamber, the very air thick with a palpable sense of dread and foreboding. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus pulsed with a frenetic intensity, casting an eerie, distorted glow across the scene that made my skin crawl. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this unholy entity. But the weight of the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force, and I found myself torn between the desire to protect the world from this malevolent force and the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume me from within. The figure's twisted, distorted form continued to shift and contort, its essence defying all rational explanation. The transformed creatures, now little more than mindless, twisted abominations, continued their frenzied, futile assault, their hollow eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality, seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus cast an eerie, flickering glow across the scene, and I knew that I was witnessing the unleashing of a force that would test the limits of my newfound power and push the boundaries of my very sanity. And as the figure turned its hollow, inhuman gaze upon me once more, I felt a surge of primal, instinctive terror that threatened to consume me from within. The malevolent presence seemed to fill the chamber, the very air thick with a palpable sense of dread and foreboding. And I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a confrontation that would determine the very fate of the world. The transformed creatures, now little more than twisted, lifeless husks, continued their frenzied, futile assault, their movements jerky and erratic, yet driven by a primal, instinctive hunger that seemed to transcend the bounds of the natural world. Their hollow eyes burned with a malevolent, unholy light, and I watched in a mixture of awe and revulsion as they converged upon the figure, their twisted, deformed limbs flailing wildly. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus pulsed with a frenetic intensity, casting an eerie, distorted glow across the scene that made my heart race with terror. The figure's movements were mesmerizing, its fluid, graceful motions a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the transformed creatures. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this unholy entity. But the weight of the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force, and I found myself paralyzed, torn between the desire to protect the world from this malevolent force and the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume me from within. The transformed creatures continued their frenzied, futile assault, but their efforts were in vain, the figure brushing them aside with a casual, effortless grace, as if they were nothing more than insignificant insects. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power, and I felt a surge of desperation and fear. The figure's twisted, distorted form continued to shift and contort, its essence defying all rational explanation. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the scene that made my skin crawl. The transformed creatures, now little more than mindless, twisted abominations, seemed to sense a shift in the balance of power, their movements becoming increasingly erratic and desperate. I watched, transfixed, as the figure and the transformed creatures clashed in a brutal, unforgiving melee, their movements a blur of twisted, deformed limbs and guttural, inhuman screeches. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the pulsing energy of the sarcophagus, and I felt a surge of both awe and revulsion at the sheer, unearthly power that was being unleashed before me. The figure's hollow, inhuman gaze remained fixed upon me, its malevolent presence bearing down upon me with an almost physical force. The darkness seemed to seep into my very being, and I felt a chill run down my spine, a primal, instinctive terror that threatened to consume me from within. The transformed creatures, now reduced to little more than twisted, lifeless husks, continued their frenzied, futile assault, their movements becoming increasingly erratic and desperate as the figure brushed them aside with a casual, effortless grace. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. And I knew that I was witnessing the unleashing of a force that would test the limits of my newfound power and push the boundaries of my very sanity. And as the figure turned its attention back to me, I felt a surge of desperation and fear. The malevolent presence seemed to fill the chamber, the very air thick with a palpable sense of dread and foreboding. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus pulsed with a frenetic intensity, casting an eerie, distorted glow across the scene that made my skin crawl. The figure's twisted, distorted form continued to shift and contort, its essence defying all rational explanation. The transformed creatures, now little more than mindless, twisted abominations, seemed to sense a shift in the balance of power, their movements becoming increasingly erratic and desperate. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the very fabric of reality seeming to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy power. And I knew that I was standing at the precipice of a confrontation that would determine the very fate of the world. The malevolent presence seemed to permeate every corner of the chamber, the air thick with a suffocating aura of dread and foreboding. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus surged, the cold, unearthly light casting an eerie, flickering glow across the scene that made my heart race with terror. I could feel the darkness seeping into my very being, the weight of the figure's gaze bearing down upon me with an almost physical force. The transformed creatures, now reduced to little more than twisted, lifeless husks, continued their frenzied, futile assault, their movements erratic and desperate. Their hollow eyes burned with a malevolent, unholy light, and I watched in a mixture of awe and revulsion as they converged upon the figure, their twisted, deformed limbs flailing wildly. The figure's movements were mesmerizing, its fluid, graceful motions a chilling contrast to the shambling gait of the transformed creatures. It seemed to move with a purpose, a malevolent intent that sent a chill down my spine. And as it turned its attention back to me, I felt a surge of primal, instinctive terror that threatened to consume me from within. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the pulsing energy of the sarcophagus, and I felt a surge of both awe and revulsion at the sheer, unearthly power that was being unleashed before me. The very fabric of reality seemed to strain and buckle under the weight of this unholy force, and I knew that I was witnessing the unleashing of a power that would test the limits of my newfound abilities and push the boundaries of my sanity. I watched transfixed as the figure and the transformed creatures clashed in a brutal, unforgiving melee, their movements a blur of twisted, deformed limbs and guttural, inhuman screeches. The cold, unearthly light from the sarcophagus pulsed with a frenetic intensity, casting an eerie, distorted glow across the scene that made my skin crawl. And as the figure turned its hollow, inhuman gaze upon me once more, I felt a surge of desperation and fear. The malevolent presence seemed to fill the chamber, the very air thick with a palpable sense of dread and foreboding. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this unholy entity. But the weight of the decision bore down upon me with an overwhelming, crushing force, and I found myself paralyzed, torn between the desire to protect the world from this malevolent force and the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume me from within. I knew that I had to act, that I had to harness the power of the sarcophagus to confront this unholy entity. But my body felt heavy, as if lead had poured into my veins, paralyzing me with fear. The tension in the chamber was nearly unbearable, each heartbeat echoing in the silence, underscored by the grotesque sounds of the chaotic battle unfolding before me. The air around me seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, as if it hungered for chaos and despair. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, a bone-chilling reminder that darkness thrived in places where light dared not linger. The flickering glow from the sarcophagus illuminated the figure's face for a fleeting moment, revealing a visage of dread, eyes like bottomless pits, devoid of reason or mercy, and a mouth twisted in a grin that seemed pulled from the depths of nightmares. With a surge of adrenaline, I stepped forward, each tentative movement weighed down by the realization of what I was up against. The battle raged on, the transformed creatures throwing themselves at the figure, their hollow howls reverberating off the stone walls. I could see limbs dislocating in grotesque contortions, dropping lifelessly to the ground, only to be ignored by the figure, who moved with an otherworldly grace, gliding effortlessly through the chaos. Suddenly, a grisly sight caught my eye. One of the creatures, a former man, now a twisted abomination, caught the figure's attention, lunging with a primal fury. Its deformed jaw opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glistened with a viscous fluid, as if hungry for a meal freshly torn from the living. The figure, without hesitation, pivoted and with a swift, fluid motion, sent an arm out to grasp the creature, fingers elongating unnaturally, wrapping around its throat like vines constricting a helpless prey. A sickening crack echoed in the chamber as the figure snapped the creature's neck, letting its lifeless body collapse to the ground. I recoiled at the sheer brutality, a wave of nausea washing over me. Would I become another victim to this entity's insatiable hunger? Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, urging me to flee, to escape the pulsating darkness that loomed ever closer. But a deeper instinct pushed me to stay. The pulsating energy from the sarcophagus beckoned me, its cold luminescence whispering promises of power. As the figure dispatched another transformed creature with eerie efficiency, I started to move toward the sarcophagus, feeling as though fate itself was guiding me. I reached out and placed my trembling hand against the ancient tomb, the cold surface sending electric shocks coursing through me. In that moment, visions flooded my mind, flickering images of ancient rituals and long-buried secrets, of power both alluring and terrifying. It both exhilarated and terrified me, intoxicating me with its dark allure. I could hear the whispers now, soft and seductive, urging me to unlock the secrets contained within. But as I focused on the sarcophagus, a deafening shriek erupted from the figure, reverberating through the chamber, shaking the very foundations. In that dreadful cry was a raw, unbridled rage, a sound that carried the weight of ages, of ancient grudges and forgotten terrors. It seemed to sense my growing connection to the sarcophagus and turned its attention toward me, momentarily abandoning the battle. Its eyes bored into mine, and I felt a paralyzing fear grip my heart. The darkness in those eyes promised suffering, an eternity of torment. I found myself frozen, unable to move or even look away. The world around me faded, the chaotic battle dissolving into a whirl of shadows and haunting whispers, and I was left in a chilling silence, the weight of the creature's gaze pinning me in place. Then, as if waking from a dream, I remembered the power thrumming through the sarcophagus. Drawing on that energy, I took a deep breath, mustering every ounce of courage I had left. With sudden resolve, I pushed away the fear, focusing on the pulse of energy connecting me to the ancient tomb. As I did, the eerie light intensified, illuminating the chamber in a ghostly glow, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of connection, an understanding of the force requesting to be unleashed. In my mind, a single command echoed. I had to confront the darkness, to claim the power for myself before it consumed everything. As I released a primal scream, a shockwave erupted from the sarcophagus, forcing the figure to stumble back even as it lashed out in anger. The transformed creatures halted, momentarily stunned by the sudden surge of energy. I could feel the power within me rising like a tidal wave, promising not just protection but vengeance. The figures that had once overwhelmed me now seemed to cower back, the unholy light pushing them away. The chamber, once filled with the sounds of battle, was now silent except for my pounding heart, the energy swirling around me like a tempest. Knowing I had but one chance, I channeled everything into a singular, desperate thought, one that rang true in the darkened chamber. It was not just a battle against the figure, but against the very essence of despair it represented. As the echoes of my thoughts filled the room, the air shimmered, and the pulsating light from the sarcophagus aligned with my will, charging through the air towards the malevolent entity. With a deafening roar, the energy erupted forward, a blinding wave that surged towards the figure. I felt the overwhelming rush of power, as if the ancient darkness unleashed within the sarcophagus had found its vessel in me. It struck the creature, illuminating the room with a brilliant light, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the barest hint of fear flicker across its twisted features. Then came a thunderous crack, as if the very fabric of reality was being ripped apart. The light swallowed everything, and I realized this battle was only beginning. With a deafening roar, the energy erupted forward, a blinding wave that surged towards the figure. I felt the overwhelming rush of power, as if the ancient darkness unleashed within the sarcophagus had found its vessel in me. It struck the creature, illuminating the room with a brilliant light, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the barest hint of fear flicker across its twisted features. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber, rattling loose stones and sending dust cascading from the ceiling like snow in an avalanche. The thrill of power surged within me, but it was quickly overshadowed by a creeping dread as the figure, now enraged, began to reshape itself. Dark tendrils coiled around its form, stretching and twisting as it absorbed the impact of my energy and transformed that force into a sinister weapon, a weapon born of pure malice. With a guttural growl, the entity launched itself at me, the twisted shadows that it commanded swirling violently around its body, forming an undulating mass of darkness that seemed alive. The walls trembled, and I could sense the very air quaking with the energy of our clash. I barely had time to react as it lunged forward, tendrils of shadow reaching for me, seeking to drag me back into the depths of despair I'd fought so hard against. Panic surged through me, and instinct took over. I called upon the power of the sarcophagus again, feeling its chilling energy coursing through my veins, wrapping around my heart and amplifying my emotions. I summoned a shield of blinding light, a desperate barrier born from raw fear and determination. The shadowy tendrils lashed against it with an unholy shriek, the sound like the cries of countless lost souls, echoing through the chamber and reverberating in my bones. But the shadows were relentless, probing my defenses, searching for cracks in my will. I felt the pressure mounting, the weight of darkness trying to crush me. The desperation clawed at my mind, whispering thoughts of defeat, reminding me of the fate that awaited anyone who dared stand against such an incomprehensible force. It was a temptation to give in, to succumb and let the growing fear wash me away. But I clenched my teeth, focusing on the light within me. I gathered every scrap of courage I had left, channeling it into the barrier. Each pulse of energy felt like a heartbeat of defiance, a refusal to be consumed. The radiant glow intensified, pushing back against the suffocating gloom. The entity recoiled for a heartbeat, surprise flashing in its hollow gaze. Seizing the moment, I thrust my arms forward, sending a radiant wave surging toward the figure. The light struck it with a force that sent shockwaves vibrating throughout the chamber, scattering the shadows like leaves caught in a storm. For a brief second, I could almost believe victory was possible. But even as the figure was pushed back, I could see the shadows coiling around it, stitching the darkness back together. The momentary setback only seemed to fuel its rage. I felt the room growing colder, an eerie silence enveloping us as if the darkness was holding its breath, ready to exhale a blight upon all that stood before it. Then, the temperature dropped, an icy grip that seeped into my very bones. The air around me thickened, turning heavy and oppressive. I was forced to my knees by a sudden wave of despair that felt like a shroud wrapping around me. Every sliver of hope I had felt moments ago began to dim, extinguished by the ever-encroaching void that threatened to swallow me whole. In that terrifying moment, images flashed through my mind, visions of others lost to this malevolent force, consumed by their own fears, leaving only shadows behind. Friends, family, strangers, all mere echoes of life snuffed out in the yawning abyss. I felt my resolve wavering, the weight of their loss pressing down on my heart like a chilled stone. But then, something deep within me ignited, a flicker of stubborn defiance that refused to be quenched. Through the despair, I found a reservoir of strength, a bond with the flickering memories of those I had lost and those who had once stood against the darkness. I remembered their faces, their laughter. I remembered their courage even when faced with unspeakable terror. Fueled by that memory, I barely breathed out a battle cry, pushing against the weight of the entity's malice. A brilliant light erupted from within me as I stood, pushing against the chill that sought to devour me. The air crackled as the power coalesced into a bolt of pure, radiant energy, surging toward the darkness with unrelenting force. I aimed for the figure's heart, the core of the entity's existence. As the energy collided with the figure, a blinding explosion illuminated the chamber, washing everything in a stark white light. The shadows that had threatened to ensnare me began to dissolve, the grip of despair broken. But the battle was far from over. The figure writhed in agony, its form contorting in consternation, battling against the light that threatened to consume it. And yet, even in its torment, I sensed a deeper, more ancient power lingering beneath the surface, an essence that thrived on chaos and anguish. The entity shrieked, a sound that rattled my very soul, a noise that spoke of ages-old wrath and unquenchable hunger. Its twisted body began to grow, absorbing the ambient darkness, fueling its rebirth, morphing it into something even more horrific. And accompanying this grotesque transformation came a dreadful realization. For every bit of light I wielded, the darkness grew stronger, more chaotic. I felt the walls pulse with the energy of our struggle as cracks spiderwebbed across the ancient stone. Each pulsation echoed my heartbeat, a reminder that time was running out. I could not let this creature claw its way back to full power. I had to take the fight to the next level, to draw deeper from the well of light that surged around me. Channeling everything I had into a final attack, I focused my will and unleashed the energy in a concentrated blast aimed directly at the chaos. The roiling darkness met my light head-on, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the force of good might truly prevail against this ancient evil. But then came the counterforce, and I felt the backlash like a tidal wave crashing over me, pushing me back against the cold stone walls. I fought against the wave, the sensation of drowning in darkness overwhelming. The chamber echoed with the cacophony of our battle, like a symphony of chaos and fury. I could sense the figure regrouping, tasting the triumph of chaos. And I knew this was the climax of our confrontation. A single moment where the very essence of light and dark would either collide or coalesce. I gritted my teeth, struggling to maintain my stance. Fear clawed at the edges of my mind, threatening to break my concentration. I could almost hear the whispers again, urging me to submit, to surrender to the sweet lure of oblivion. But with one last surge of defiance, I pushed harder, recalling the people I fought for, those who trusted me to stand against this horror. And just as I thought I would be consumed by the shadows, my power finally shattered the oppressive darkness, sending waves of brilliant light cascading across the chamber. I roared, summoning the energy of all those lives lost to darkness, merging it with my own. The figure shuddered, its twisted features contorting in disbelief as my light burst through the void, illuminating the entire stone chamber in blinding purity. I felt the walls pulsate around me, as if they were alive, the ancient stones vibrating with energies beyond time. Just as I thought I had broken through, the air crackled with an ominous silence, and within that silence, I heard a low voice, laden with malice and timelessness, rising from the darkness. "You think you can defeat me?" it whispered, the sound like a breath against my skin, chilling and sinister. "You are but a fleeting moment, a flicker in the grand darkness that is my existence." And with those words, I felt the ground beneath me tremble, the shadows swirling violently around the figure, coalescing into a storm that threatened to engulf everything in its path. The walls shook and cracked further, fragments raining down like the last desperate remnants of a crumbling reality. The battle was far from over. In fact, it felt as though a far darker ordeal was about to begin. The lights dimmed as darkness began to reclaim its territory, swirling with a menacing force that seemed determined to extinguish what little hope remained. I could feel the shadows wrapping around my legs, tugging at me with icy fingers, seeking to drag me back into the depths of despair. In that moment of desperation, I realized I had to dig even deeper to find an inner strength that had lain hidden beneath layers of fear. I closed my eyes, letting the panic seep away, focusing instead on the light and the memories of every soul trapped in that torment. With each heartbeat, I envisioned them rallying alongside me, their spirits intertwining with my will, their defiance sewn into the very fabric of my being. I lifted my hands, palms outstretched, calling upon the energies in the chamber to coalesce within me, drawing from their collective strength. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of resistance, fueling my resolve. I spread my arms wide, letting the light burst forth from every pore, illuminating the darkness as though I were a beacon amid the storm raging around me. The shadows recoiled as the light erupted from within me, searing through the gloom like a sword cleaving through darkness. I could feel the tendrils of despair releasing their grip, the malevolent figure staggering back. This was my moment, my chance to not only battle, but to banish this darkness back to the abyss from which it had crawled. I stepped forward, pushing through the waves of shadow, trying to envelop me. Each step planting my feet firmly in the ground as though anchoring myself against the ever-growing tide. The light blazed more ferociously, illuminating every corner of the chamber, until it felt as though it was not just a fight for survival, but the awakening of an ancient promise. The promise that light could, indeed, triumph over darkness. Even as the malevolent force shrieked in rage and pain, a sound that could shatter even the strongest of wills, I stood tall, unyielding, as tendrils of darkness reached out desperately to reclaim its hold over me. I drew on the energy surrounding me, allowing the brilliance of my light to consume everything in its path. As I summoned a final wave of incandescent energy, I saw the figure writhe in anguish. The shadows surrounding it began to unravel, holes of pure light piercing the darkness. It was a sight so profound. I felt a surge of hope flooding through me as I moved closer, determined to bring this nightmare to an end. And yet, deep within the shadows, something ancient stirred, stirring a counterforce more powerful than I could comprehend. The figure raised its head, and for a fleeting moment, I was caught within its gaze. That horrific, hollow stare pierced through me, and in that instant, I knew exactly what this creature was capable of: pain, despair, and an insatiable hunger that had devoured so many before me. Gathering the remnants of my strength, I pushed forward. The swirling darkness began to tremble and dissipate, the shadows unraveling in the face of my light. I was no longer just fighting to survive. I was fighting for every soul the figure had stolen, for every life quashed beneath its malevolent shadow. As I unleashed the final act of defiance against the ancient evil, I sensed an immense force gathering behind me. A bolt of light now charged with the combined strength of every spirit that had championed against this overwhelming darkness. And as it surged toward the figure, the chamber erupted in a blinding flash, illuminating the depths of the abyss, laying bare the chaos and horror that had lingered for so long. The scream of the entity rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of terror and rage that shook the walls and rattled the very foundations of existence. With one final surge, the light pierced through the heart of darkness. Time froze as the energies collided, light battling shadow in a violent clash that would decide the fate of all. And as I stood at the center of this tumultuous storm, I knew this was not just a battle for my life. It was the final reckoning between creation and destruction, a moment that would echo throughout the ages. But in the eye of the storm, amidst the blinding chaos, an unsettling question lingered. In the depths of darkness, would I emerge as the savior, or would I too be consumed, forever lost to the shadows? I could not waver now. I had come too far, and I would fight until every ounce of darkness was erased from existence. And so, with determination fueling my every breath, I embraced the light, becoming one with the energy that surged within, ready to face whatever horror awaited me on the other side. But in the chaos of light and shadow, I felt something shift within me. It was as if the remnants of despair that had lingered in the air filled my lungs and threatened to drown me. I had embraced the light, yet a part of me shivered with unease. The entity may have been pushed back, but I could sense that it was not done. The moment of blinding brightness faded, leaving behind a chilling silence, one so thick that it pressed down on me like a heavy shroud. The air turned still, and I held my breath, straining to listen for any sounds from the abyss. The entity was no longer screaming, no longer thrashing in the light. It was as if the very essence of the darkness had gathered itself, holding its breath, preparing for something worse. Cracks snaked across the ancient stone walls, shadows seeping from the fissures. They slithered like serpents across the floor, inching toward me with an insidious hunger. I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet, the tremors echoing my rising fear. Heart pounding, I knew the darkness was not merely a sentient being. It was a force, a void that devoured hope and light. The walls began to shake violently, dust and debris raining down around me, choking the air. Shadows pooled and gathered at the edges of my vision, slipping out of my control. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to remain grounded. If I lost my focus now, the darkness would seize its chance. Suddenly, from the depths of that oppressive silence, a low growl emanated. It curled around me like a thick fog, wrapping tightly around my throat, squeezing until I could barely swallow. The darkness coalesced into a grotesque form, one that twisted and squirmed, its features shifting between those of the damned. Eyes, thousands of them, flashed open across its form, reflecting my fear back at me, a mirror of my deepest nightmares. Unfathomable whispers filled the chamber, 1,000 voices combining into a single sound that carried a dreadful familiarity. I could hear the cries of those lost to despair, their lament echoing in my ears, more sorrowful than any sound I'd ever known. It was a reminder that I was not just fighting for my own survival, but for those whose spirits still clung to the edges of this world. I staggered back, the weight of their grief crashing over me like waves, each one more suffocating than the last. I could almost see them in the shadows, their faces twisted in anguish, reaching out, begging for liberation. What if I failed? What if I became yet another soul trapped in this nightmarish cycle, lost to the shadows that were inching ever closer? As I fought to keep my feet beneath me, the entity that had once appeared to be monstrous morphed further, stretching its form in a grotesque parody of life. Tendrils of darkness shot out, probing the ground like gnarled fingers searching for something lost, wrapping around stones, chipping away at my resolve. I felt them caress my skin, cool and clammy, searching for weaknesses, seeking to anchor me in this realm of despair. Without thinking, I lashed out, a wave of light crashing forth from my hand. The surge knocked the tendrils back momentarily, but they quickly recovered, growing thicker, as if empowered by my fear. Desperation clawed at me as I realized this last burst of energy had only fed the shadows, fueled their hunger. A chilling realization struck. This creature thrived on fear. The bleakness of my thoughts only served to strengthen it as it leered at me, growing bolder, rising from the ground like a dark mist from a swamp. I had already fought so long. My body was weary. Every movement felt labored, and a dark promise of suffering lay ahead if I failed. But beneath that despair, something flickered, a remembrance of light and warmth from those I had lost. They were not mere shadows. They were the fire sparking my defiance against this nightmare. I began to chant softly, invoking their names, thinking of their bravery, the bond that tied us together even in death. As I spoke their names, I felt a pulse of energy surge within me. It was as if their spirits stirred, lending me their strength in that moment of dread. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as if struck, releasing that crippling hold that threatened to crush me once and for all. The weight of despair lifted, ever so slightly, emboldening my stance. The figure continued to change, pulling itself upright as if fed by a dark thunderstorm, its shape growing larger and more menacing than before. I could almost make out a face amidst the swirling mass, a grotesque likeness of something human, eyes hollow and full of insatiable hunger that promised nothing but suffering. In the eerie silence that followed my chant, a wind stirred through the chamber, whipping around me and shaking dust from above. The shadows writhed and twisted, as if they were alive, swirling around the entity, feeding on the chaos, the empowerment from my fear seemingly strengthening its form. The air turned frigid, and I felt a pull, an invisible force beckoning me to join the darkness. Voices of the damned grew louder, calling my name, promising peace if I would only surrender. But I was done submitting. My heart thundered with fierce resolve as I shifted my perspective, looking beyond the dark tendrils. Recognizing the truth, the light around me didn't just come from the sarcophagus. It came from within me. I was not just a vessel. I was a beacon, ready to push back against this alien terror. I planted my feet firmly on the ground, feeling the pulse of energy underneath, connecting with the core of my being. I took a deep breath, channeling all my fear and memories into a single thought, a wordless prayer that surged through the chamber. Around me, light began to rise, white and gold, spilling from within me as I began to harness it like a storm, forming it into a protective barrier that pulsed continuously like the heartbeat of a giant. With every ounce of my will, I thrust my hands forward, constructing a barrier against the entity, a radiant wall that stood between me and the abyss lurking just beyond my sight. In that divine moment, the whispers backed away, the shadows retreating, hissing like boiling water, refusing to take me into their fold. The creature howled, its voice a cacophony that struck at my very soul, reverberating through the chamber as if the darkness itself was in agony. Each howl seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 tortured souls, echoing with endless torment. Yet I held my ground, more powerful than the shadows, more resilient than the most persistent of fears. As the barrier brightened, the darkness clamored against it, trying to break through, and I felt the pain of its struggles radiate into my own heart. It fed on my fear, but I turned it into defiance. I would not allow myself to be its next meal. I concentrated harder, weaving together every ounce of strength I had into a fierce resolve that rippled outward, expanding my shield, pushing back against the inky mass. The creature howled in rage, its form contorting as bright fissures began to sear through its shadows. I could feel the energy of those I had lost surging within me, infusing my spirit with hope. Just when it seemed that my light might banish the darkness once and for all, something shifted. Tension rippled through the air like the moment before a thunderstorm. Shadows coalesced into a dense cloud above me, twisting into forms that felt eerily familiar. They morphed into specters of those I failed to save, faces from my past, warped by their own suffering, floating just out of reach. They reached for me with skeletal hands, their mouths moving, whispering words I could not hear. Horror washed over me as I realized I was looking into the faces of the ones I had fought for, and I felt the weight of their despair pressing in, threatening to pull me back into the shadows. Were they offering solace or despair? Were they here to give me strength or to lower me into the depths of darkness? As their figures loomed closer, an overwhelming chill gripped my heart. My fragile shield, each ray of light, flickered uncertainly. I could feel the darkness deep within me, rising, clawing, wanting to join those figures in the shadows. I wanted to turn away, to close my eyes, but the moment felt too sacred to abandon. If I failed now, their souls would be forever trapped here, a hallowed testament to despair. "It's not your time," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. But the shadows twisted and turned, eagerly seeking their moment of victory, a dark vortex that threatened to collapse all hope. The voices of the lost began to drown out my thoughts, wrapping my mind in a numbing fog. It felt like fingernails scraping against a chalkboard, an endless cacophony of grief that threatened to pull me beneath the weight of despair. Breathless, my chest ached as I clenched my fists, the memories of every face fueling my resolve. With a scream, I pushed against the encroaching shadows, willing myself to remember the warmth of life, of laughter, of every precious moment spent with them. I let my light shine brighter, restoring my barrier. The air crackled with energy as I fought against the spectral hands reaching for me. It was a feeling of both defiance and grief, a battle that felt more intimate than any physical confrontation. It was the essence of life itself, of love mingled with loss, a connection wrapped in a painful display of remembrance. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in anguish as the warmth of my memories pierced through, cutting into their terrifying grasp. I could feel the flickers of energy rising around me, each spark ignited by love and loss, and slowly but surely, I began to diffuse the darkness consuming me, refusing to let it take my heart. In each memory, I recalled a face, and on each face, I saw a spark of light, the promise of resistance against the dark. Those sparks began to take form within the chamber, ethereal figures filled with long-forgotten strength emerging from the shadows, rising against the entity that haunted me. It was not just my fight anymore, it was theirs too. As the figures gathered around me, their glowing energies combined with my own, forming a brilliant light that surged forward, meeting the dark creature head-on. With a roar that echoed through the emptiness, the figure struggled, and for the first time, I saw it falter, the writhing tendrils of shadow unraveling, collapsing under the weight of lost souls united in defiance. I felt a tidal wave of power surge within me, and I pushed onward, reaching deep within the chaotic mass to find the heart of the anguish that bound it, its source of terror and despair. With each heartbeat, I summoned the strength I had left, merging with the radiant light of those united against the darkness. One final surge, one ultimate push, and as I thrust my hands forward, the radiant force erupted, cascading through the shadows, obliterating them into shards of light. The shriek that erupted from the entity shook the very foundations of the realm around us, reverberating, echoing into the void, a sound that signaled not just rage, but a final scream of despair. With beam after beam of energy striking forth, the shadows disintegrated, torn apart by the unity of hope and love. The air began to shimmer and pulsate with the growing brightness, each pulse a declaration of resilience, surging until it encompassed everything in a blinding radiance, so potent that I thought it would tear the very fabric of reality apart. And just as it seemed the darkness would be annihilated forever, the remaining shadows coalesced into a figure, larger, darker, more powerful than before. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, a desperate foreboding creeping back into the very stones. Amidst the blinding light, I saw the grotesque shape thrumming with frantic energy, its many eyes narrowing in determination as it prepared for a final stand against this overwhelming wave of hope. I could sense it gathering its dark essence, focusing on the spark of light that illuminated the chamber, preparing to unleash one last, terrible assault. Not today, I thought, trembling but resolute. And as the figure grew darker, spiraling into a tempest of shadows, I felt the surge of empowerment from the remembrance of every soul surrounding me. I could feel their warmth, their strength within me like a chorus, a rising tide of defiance. Each flickering flame of hope shared the burning resolve to end this nightmare once and for all. With a heart wide open, ready for any outcome, I reached deep within myself, summoning a final wave of energy more potent than anything I had conjured before. It was a fusion of everything I believed: love, hope, anger, and determination. This energy surged forth from my hands like a comet, cleaving through the darkness, headed straight for the heart of the malevolent entity that had haunted me for so long. But as the light roared toward its target, I could see the manifestation of deep-seated fear flicker in the creature's eyes. A moment of clarity pierced through the chaos. I realized this darkness mattered beyond my mortal struggle. It was a part of something much larger, a darkness born of despair that had echoed throughout from the shadows of countless souls lost in the void. I felt their anguish coursing through the entity, a flood of pain that went deeper than fear alone. This was not just an unnatural force. It was born of suffering, a manifestation of every heart that had known despair, now clawing for freedom at any cost. As my light surged closer, illuminating the chilling void around us, the darkness writhed and twisted in defiance. Tendrils whipped violently in frantic arcs, trying to snatch away the warmth that threatened to consume its being. Each lash felt like fingers of ice, longing to pull me into the depths of its sorrowful abyss. But I pressed on, heart racing with a strange kind of determination. Suddenly, the creature let out a roar, a guttural sound that vibrated through the very bones of the chamber, chilling me to the core. It was a sound filled with rage and fear, a sound that echoed not just my impending doom, but a deeper, primal terror of something far greater than this battle. Against my will, I felt a shiver up my spine as its shriek clawed at my sanity, unleashing a wave of dread that lashed around me like a storm. The room seemed to bulge and warp under its power, shadows swirling into grotesque forms that danced in the corners of my vision. They twisted into faces I recognized, former friends, relatives, all bearing spectral eyes heavy with sorrow. They reached out with gnarled hands, beckoning me to join them as the entity's voice became a symphony of whispers, urging me to surrender. "I'm here," I breathed, answering the phantom figures. "I will not forget you." But the darkness pulsated, filling every crevice with a presence that sought to suffocate my thoughts. I could feel its scraping touch against my mind, trying to unravel my will and replace it with despair. It wanted me to see nothing but horror, to doubt every fragment of hope left in my heart. In that moment of doubt, I hesitated. The flickering light began to dim, and the howling grew louder, consuming the silence that had once comforted me. The shadows thickened, pulling closer, inching their darkness against the fragile shield that I had so desperately built. A sense of foreboding crept over me, wrapping around my chest like an iron vice, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I knew I had moments left, mere seconds before I would be overwhelmed. Every ounce of courage I clung to began to falter as I recalled the swirling darkness that feasted on despair. Images of failure and loss flooded my mind, and I felt my grip on the light loosen with each passing moment. And then I saw it, a glimmer in the darkness, an almost ethereal glow cutting through the black, the very essence of defeat hanging at the precipice. It was the ghostly outline of hope, fragile but undeniable. It whispered to me, reminding me of the fight I'd embarked on. Even in despair, I had love, connection, and memories, the brightest light in the deepest darkness. "No!" I screamed, shaking off the creeping shadows. I drew from that flickering spark, feeling it grow stronger with each heartbeat. I grabbed the memories of all those I had lost, all their laughter and love mingling into a ball of radiant energy. With a visceral scream born from my heart, I unleashed it, letting the warmth spread through me, bathing the chamber in brilliant light. Shadows shrieked and recoiled, but the figure at the center remained defiantly poised, a behemoth of encroaching darkness. Even as I poured everything I had into the light, I could see its form shifting, adapting to the force I wielded, ready to absorb what I offered. It grew larger, more insatiable, opening a maw lined with teeth that gleamed like obsidian. The roar of the entity reached a deafening crescendo in that moment until it aimed right for me. The pressure of its anger surged in wave after wave, assaulting my senses until I feared it might tear me apart. Images flickered before my eyes again, each a ghostly reminder of the shadows that awaited me if I failed. I couldn't afford to be lost within them. Concentrating fiercely, I envisioned every light that once danced within the lives that had come before me, the sheer joy and love that refused to be extinguished. My heart beat in rhythm with my memories, each thump an affirmation of life against the cacophony of darkness. I could feel the boundaries between light and shadow morphing, blurring into an unrecognizable storm of emotions that tore at my very being. Drawing more power from within, I willed it to the surface, letting the memories amalgamate until they were no longer separate. They became part of me. This was not just a battle against darkness. It was a celebration of existence, a testament to those souls who had fought and endured. As the shadows writhed helplessly around my radiant core, I took a step forward, speaking's words, a powerful invocation fueled by all my memories. "You will not take me. You have no right to our pain." It was a declaration, a challenge that seemed to reverberate through the chamber. In response, the creature lashed out, sending out a wave of pure darkness that clawed at my vision. I braced myself, but instead of crumbling under its ferocity, I let out a cry as the light within me surged forward. It shattered the wave of shadow like glass, scattering tiny shards of darkness across the stone floor. The darkness pushed back against my light, the contact electrifying as the two forces collided in a visceral struggle. Each pulse felt like a heartbeat, a growing war that roared between us. The air hummed with an energy, so thick it felt alive. I could feel the weight of its presence behind me, the lost souls gathering, their collective strength focusing into the barrier I had conjured. In that moment, I understood the entity sought to devour memories, to erase love and connection. It didn't just thrive on anguish. It wanted to erase the essence of humanity itself, to render us as nothing more than shadows of what we once were. With newfound determination, I surged forward, unleashing the full force of light that had grown within. A brilliant beam erupted from my heart, washing over the entity, illuminating every corner of the dark chamber. The might of my memories combined with every spark of light from the reflections of those I held dear, forcing the shadows back like waves receding from the shore. But the creature was relentless, its own desperation fueling its might, clawing for power to absorb the light pushing against it. Tendrils lashed out, striking against my shield, seeking an opening, searching for the weak spot in my resolve. I could feel them again, the creeping touch of despair inching closer, but I cut it off with my will. No more fear, no more surrender. The world trembled as blinding light erupted, scorching, smearing streaks of radiance across the walls as the shadows shrieked in retaliation. It was a cacophony of dissonance and rage, echoing endlessly around me, accompanied by a freezing atmosphere that threatened to enclose me in an iron grip of despair. Suddenly, the chamber began to ripple, distorting, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Muffled sounds and distant pleas began to tug at the edges of my awareness, voices reading through the dark gloom, their messages lost among the shadows. "Help us! In this," they seemed to cry. Then in a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, I felt a surge within me, an echo that resonated with understanding. The souls trapped within the entity were not meant to be consumed. They were echoes of lives lived, moments that rooted them to existence. If the shadows sought to erase their memories, perhaps my light could set them free. Emboldened, I stretched out my hand, allowing the light to flow through me and to those lost souls, infusing them with energy, raising them from the brink of darkness. One by one, flickers of warmth ignited around me, and I could see them, their features beginning to solidify, spirits no longer shackled by fear. They joined with my own light, swirling around me like a brilliant aurora, shifting in colors that painted the chamber in hues of hope. Walls trembled, and the shadows screeched louder, twisting in agony as the light fractured their hold. Flickers of life encircled me, their energy spiraling upward, forming a protective barrier that pushed against the suffocating darkness. Together, we built a radiant barrier strong enough to sustain the rising tide of anguish that clawed at their souls, determined to extinguish the last remnants of light. The creature convulsed, caught between the swells of despair and my fierce hope. For a fleeting moment, I saw its true form, an amalgamation of distorted faces and anguished cries, each one representing a sorrowful tale of grief it had consumed and twisted into darkness. I almost faltered at this grotesque sight, the raw and twisted visage reflecting my own fearful thoughts and vulnerabilities, but I tightened my resolve. "No more," I declared, feeling the warmth of the souls enfolding me, igniting a fire within my heart. "You will reclaim nothing. This ends here." And with that declaration, the light surged once more, blasting through the darkness like a subsonic ripple. The walls cracked under the weight of our combined force, shards of shadow splintering into shards that evaporated into glimmers of light. The cries of the lost echoed in harmony with the defiant roar of my light. And for the first time, the entity seemed to falter, hesitation injecting a crack into its consuming void. But just as I felt victory grip my heart, the shadows coalesced anew. A roiling mass swept across the chamber, grasping fiercely at the spirit figures buoying around me, peeling them away one by one. I watched in horror as the light flickered, dimming for the first time, the cries of the souls melding into a keening wail of despair that reverberated against my bones. "Help us!" I felt a surge of dread. The darkness had noticed my moment of vulnerability, sensed the weakening of my resolve, and it lashed out with renewed fury. Tendrils of freezing shadow swept toward me, curling around my ankles, pulling me closer to their grasp with a chill that clung to my skin like a shroud. It whispered poison into my mind, that I was merely prolonging their suffering, feeding them false hope. Yet I remembered the warmth of their spirits surrounding me, and with every ounce of will, I pushed against the cold. My heart beat steadily, a drum of defiance. Against the silence creeping in, I could not let them go. Not now. Not when I fought so fiercely for their liberation. Drawing on every memory, every fragment of love I had ever known, I clutched that warmth tightly, refusing to let it go. I would not allow the shadows to turn their sacrifice into despair. With resolve hardening inside me, I screamed, channeling all the energy I possessed toward the shadows that threatened to drag me into the depths. I won't let you take their light. In a burst of brilliance, the last vestiges of my strength unleashed a radiant shockwave, slicing through the restraints of the shadows that had ensnared me for so long. The entity shrieked, a sound that echoed through the depths, rippling through the air around me, as if the very fabric of despair was being torn apart. I pushed forward, the light swelling to envelop at both ends, igniting the chamber with an unyielding brilliance. And at that moment, the merger of light and darkness reached a critical mass, a clash of energies that shattered into 1,000 shards of swirling light. Spectral figures surged forth, finally breaking free from the thrall of despair, dancing above the chaos as they poured their essence into my heart. Together, we magnified the light to its zenith, forging through the treacherous dark as it recoiled. But as we surged past the threshold of light, a final desperate grasp for power erupted. A shadowy arm arose, massive and twisting, reaching desperately to reclaim what it had lost. It lashed toward me with impossible speed, filled with rage, anger, and despair. A chill ran down my spine as I faced that encroaching darkness, and in that moment of unyielding fear, I felt the spirits of the lost bind with me, their essence intertwining as a shield against the incoming attack. With every ounce of strength I had left, I thrust my hands forward again, focusing all my light to collide with the mass of shadows bearing down on me. A surge of power crackled in the air, and I roared, "This ends now!" The radiant beam hurtled into the gloom, meeting the specter of that monstrous arm head-on. Light and darkness collided in a brilliant explosion, a furious ballet of light twisting in chaotic patterns. The cries of the damned echoed around me, merging into a dreadful chorus that sang of loss and lament, yet also heralded hope and warmth. As the light expanded, illuminating every crevice of the dark, I felt the weight of despair collapse upon itself, the darkness imploding into a shrieking void. Tendrils fell away, receding like a fleeing mirage, no longer able to maintain their grasp as their own shadows turned on them, devouring the entity from within, integrated into the brilliance. For a brief moment, silence enveloped the chamber, a stillness so profound that it swallowed even the last echoes of suffering. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, surrounded by the dissipating shards of shadow that crumbled away into an area of glimmering light. Yet, before the warmth of freedom could settle in, an unsettling sensation crept back through the air, a faint chill that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. The silence began to fester, twisting into something far more sinister. Shadows, though diminished, still fluttered at the edges of my newfound sanctuary, like remnants of a nightmare refusing to fade completely. From that darkness, ghostly whispers began to swirl, more insidious now than before, echoes of the memories I had conjured in battle. I remembered the faces of the lost, their spectral forms flashing before my eyes as they pleaded silently for release. For every soul I had helped to liberate, a flicker of death still lingered, a heavy veil of sorrow tethering me to the darkness. Their desperate calls now morphed into a cacophony of voices, all overlapping and intertwining, creating a dissonant symphony that clawed at my mind. The light glimmered around me, but those whispers grew louder, drowning out the peace I had fought so hard to attain. "Help us," they cried out, yet their tone shifted. It was no longer a plea, but a demand layered with longing and regret. "Don't leave us." Caught in a growing storm of uncertainty, I felt their sorrow wrap around me, squeezing my heart with an iron grip. The walls of the chamber, once illuminated, now flickered as the shadows twisted and writhed, reconstructing themselves into grotesque shapes, manifesting the very despair I thought I had banished. This was not over. The sinister entity was no longer a singular physical form, but a collective burden of souls, each one holding tightly to its pain, demanding acknowledgement. With each passing heartbeat, the brightness began to dim, clouds of darkness encroaching once again as remnants of the defeated entity sought to reclaim what had been lost. The ghostly figures flickered, their faces shifting through expressions of anguish. Despite the light I had unleashed, the tormented whispers gained strength, harmonizing into a maddening chorus that filled every fiber of my being with dread. "I can't let you fade," I shouted, but even my own voice felt weak against their rising tide of despair. I could see their features now, eyes filled with sorrow, mouths twisted into silent wails, reflections of lives cut short and histories marred by darkness. I had freed their souls, yet their pain remained etched into my consciousness, pressing upon me like a physical weight. Suddenly, shadows erupted from the corners, no longer mere remnants, but ghastly figures rising up to confront me. They twisted and contorted, their limbs elongating, faces morphing into horror-stricken masks of when they were alive. I staggered back, my heart pounding harder in my chest, trapped between the flicker of light and the encroaching terrors. The air grew thick with a suffocating tension, and I felt my own essence waning under the stare of those lost souls. "Join us," a voice hissed, echoing from a figure that stood ominously before me, a chilling reflection of my own fears. It bore the twisted features of someone I desperately wanted to save, an embodiment of grief that clawed at my very identity. The shadows behind it writhed as if to enforce its demand, stretching towards me and curling around my wrists like chains forged from despair. I fought to resist them, but the shadows were growing bolder, enacting their desperation like a curse. Slowly, the specters began to drift closer, reaching out toward me with elongated fingers that twitched with a sickening eagerness. I could see the anguish in their hollow eyes, but beneath that grief lay a potent fury, a fury directed at whomever had wronged them, an anger that wanted companionship. "You are one of us now," the air whispered as if the shadows were a unified force seeking my surrender. Suddenly, a chill surged violently around me, and I felt the longing pierce through my heart. Could I face the truth of their torment? I had wrought light upon them, yet they had not yet found peace. The eerie calm of the moment pressed against my spirit until I grasped the magnitude of my choices. As the darkness crept closer, I dove inward, searching for the burning light that had kept me resolute in my fight. Grasping it tightly, I stood firm against the tide, summoning the memory of those I loved most dearly. The warmth igniting within me became a shield, radiating outward, forcing back the shadows just enough for clarity to slice through the confusion. I could not allow their despair to become mine. My purpose was to guide them, not to dive into the depths of their misery. With a shout born of desperation and determination, I threw my hands forward. "You deserve to be free. Your pain does not define you." The light burst from my fingertips, illuminating the chamber once more, igniting the spectral figures caught between my words and the relentless darkness that sought to consume them. The radiant energy filled the room with a trembling glow, pushing against the shadows, dispersing them at the edges. But those lost souls didn't retreat. They surged forward, drawn to the light, eyes wide with longing. Their expressions twisted into something deeper than grief, something raw and vulnerable, pleading earnestly for their own liberation, for closure they believed I could provide. "Release us," they echoed, their voices merging into one resonant cry. Despite the crushing weight of their anguish, I held firm and pressed forward, allowing the light to swell ever more. "You are more than your last moments. You have stories worth telling. Love that transcends this pain." My words seemed to penetrate the shadows, stirring something in each figure as they hesitated, the darkness recoiling just a fraction as flickers of remembrance ignited their hollow gazes. Some of the figures clasped their hands over their hearts, as if I had rekindled a flame they thought long extinguished. The urgency in their pleas softened to something else: understanding, connection, and the terrifying desire for release. Still, the shadows fumed around me, furious that their hold was slipping. They fled from the light only to regroup, swelling once more into a furious wave that sought to drown me in despair. A ferocious howl echoed in the chamber, wrapping around me like a tempest, desperate to reclaim its lost connections. I could feel them, my own heart racing against the chaos, beating in time with the rhythm of their cries. "You don't have to be afraid," I implored again, my voice rising over the cacophony. But the shadows lashed out cruelly, stinging the very essence of my spirit. When it seemed as if all hope was slipping through my fingers, I remembered the power of connection, the shared stories we weave in life that become part of our essence. I gathered the memories more fiercely, felt the surging warmth flowing through me like a cresting tide. Each soul around me flickered with recognition. They began to mirror my energy, their figures trembling with light and dark, yearning for the resolution they had sought for so long. I drew closer, reaching out, not to save them, but to remind them of their worth, their laughter, their dreams, the love they once nurtured. In the climactic moment, as despair and light consolidated into one true force, my breath caught in my throat. Their faces transformed, shifting into soft smiles, memory-laden eyes sparkling. It became unmistakable. They were not just shadows forming from their anguish. They were echoes of a life cherished, loved, and yet still forgotten. The shadows blew back as if struck by a gale force, sweeping out the air around me. I could feel their pain, a fusion of every single soul that struggled with the weight of bereavement, discontent, and regret, who longed for understanding. With every flash of light, I knew they could transcend that darkness as they finally accepted recognition. A stunning luminescence burst forth from the epicenter, engulfing us all. The figures began to merge with the gleaming energy pouring from my heart, their essence mingling with the spark of hope. Together, we shattered the prison of sorrow that had held them captive, illuminating the chamber with their collective release. Then all at once, a blinding light erupted, tearing apart the dark remnants clinging to the edges, shredding the very fabric of despair in its wake. The vacuum it created pulled forth the shadows, sucking them into the embrace of brightness as they spiraled away, howling in agony until they vanished altogether. And then, for a heart-stopping moment, silence descended. The air shimmered with remnants of light, an ethereal glow illuminating the space before me. Flashes of memory surged, echoes of laughter, stories shared over candlelit tables, moments of fierce love and affection. The spirits of the lost hovered around me, contentment radiating from their forms as they transcended the darkness that had once defined them. They shimmered one last time, filling me with a warmth that encased my heart. I felt the bittersweet release of tears as they acknowledged me, their smiles brightening the air like the dawn chasing away the night. As their essence soared higher, I knew they had finally found peace, their suffering no longer a burden upon their souls. They whispered their thanks, a soft chorus that shimmered like a faded promise echoing through the ether. But just as my heart settled, a tremor rolled through the floor beneath me. The chamber quaked violently, the walls trembling as if resisting the newfound peace. The remnants of the shadows stirred restlessly, an echo of vengeance beneath the surface, seeking to reclaim their lost power. I gasped, realizing that the entity was not completely vanquished. It still lurked in the fractures of reality, casing its shadowy influence in the cracks of despair. Panic surged within me, but as I looked around, my heart resonated with resolve. This wasn't just a battle for victory. It was a confrontation with the very core of hopelessness. I couldn't face this darkness alone. As the remnants began to take shape around me, twisting into fantastic yet horrific figures, I could hear the whispers returning, taunting me like an unending cycle of dread. "Join us," they hissed, a chilling echo that curled around the remnants of my courage. "You cannot escape your fate." Memories rushed through my mind, warm and unyielding against the icy pull of the shadows. I closed my eyes tightly, calling forth every moment of love and light I had gained in the faces of those I loved, and even in those I had fought alongside. Their strength surged through me, igniting a burning resolve. "Not today!" I shouted, the words exploding from my throat with a conviction I didn't know I possessed. I could feel every heartbeat, every ounce of my spirit rising as I opened my eyes, now ablaze with a fierce light. As if responding to my sincerity, the figures flickered and surged, gathering their momentum to match my defiance. I extended my hands again, empowering myself deeper into the heart of that energy. The shadows flinched, wavering like fragile smoke against a gale. The whispers grew louder, growing desperate and frantic. "You cannot destroy us. You are one with us." "No!" I roared, the light coiling around me, forming a protective barrier that felt impenetrable against their onslaught. In that final confrontation, I poured all that I had into the light, igniting it with all the love I could muster, connecting with those lost spirits once more. And as our energies mingled, I felt the warmth solidify into a brilliant beam streaming forth, cutting through the remnants of chaos and crashing into the silhouettes haunting the chamber, the air shuddering with the clash of energies. The shadows erupted into fractals of dark light, dissipating into nothingness, fading as if they had never existed at all. I stood unmoving, heart racing in the aftermath, breathless as the last echoes of sorrow melted away, leaving behind a tranquil, luminescent glow. In the profound silence that followed, I realized I was no longer alone. The air was filled with a comforting energy, as if love itself had woven its threads into the very atmosphere. Surrounding me, the faces of those I had lost glimmered brightly in my memories, a reminder of their presence that would forever persist. Though the darkness had threatened to swallow me whole, I had emerged triumphant, not just for me, but for every soul that had ever been lost to despair, every life shaped by love, woven into the tapestry of existence. As that final shadow succumbed to the light, a serenity wrapped around me like a soft embrace. In that moment, I understood. Light and darkness are destined to coexist, intertwined in an eternal dance, but it is love that brings us back into balance, outshining even the deepest of sorrows. And as I stood, a single tear traced my cheek, a reminder of everything I had fought for. I had emerged with not just darkness behind me, but with the faith that I could carry their stories onward.